Hello and welcome back to my channel. My name is Judy and I love history, travel, and finding out how people live. Today we're going to stroll through the Boboli Gardens, a fabulous public garden on the south side of the Arno River behind the Pitti Palace in Florence. I'm an amateur gardener, confined it seems over the years to increasingly tiny plots of land, so I make it a point when I can to stroll through whatever park is nearby. Usually these are just small city or neighborhood parks, always with paths, sometimes with a water feature, and often with a monument to someone I never heard of. They can vary from a tiny public park tucked in an alley that once separated two buildings, to the Luxembourg Gardens in Paris, a tidy 60 acres or so that is so jam-packed it seems much larger, all the way to New York Central Park at 843 acres. Today we're going to look at this plot tucked behind and lovingly surrounding Florence's Pitti Palace on the Armchair Traveler. A private gardener can throw plants in whatever manner pleases, although most modern gardens are so small there really isn't a lot of choice in how they're arranged. Some people prefer the natural look, others like a more orderly and obviously manicured style. Large gardens are the same, except on a bigger scale. Today's large public gardens were all once private and restricted to use by the owner and selected guests. Styles changed over time, but generally break into two flavors: English gardens, which put pride of place on looking natural or wild when actually they're very carefully designed and manicured, and later French gardens, which put a huge emphasis on symmetry of design and were originally made stylish in most of Europe by Louis XIV's head gardener, André Le Nôtre. Le Nôtre didn't dream up the formula for this on his own. He essentially copied, with a few modifications, an earlier Italian style, which we'll see here. The Boboli garden was one of the first and most important examples of an Italian garden. The person responsible for this lovely garden was Eleanor, Duchess of Tuscany and the first wife of Duke Cosimo I. She lived from 1522 to 1562. This woman was no mere court decoration or mother of potential heirs. She was an intelligent and influential Spanish noblewoman. A keen businesswoman, she financed many of her husband's political campaigns and was actually responsible for purchasing the Pitti Palace that fronts these gardens. Duke Cosimo trusted her implicitly, not just as a wife or the head of the palace, but to run Florence in his absence when he was away at war or when he was sick. Eleanor bought the Pitti Palace, originally the home of a very rich Florentine banker named Pitti, as a summer palace for her family, although it was within walking distance of other family residences north of the Arno River. You'll see in a moment that the palace was rather small for her purpose. There was plenty of land, but not much had been done in the way of landscaping. The palace sits at the base of a rather large hill, part of which had been dug out for the facades, and leaving behind a quarry, or more likely a rather unattractive mud hole. Work clearly needed to be done on it. The gardens were laid out in the 1540s, but work of this size requires a long time to complete. The photo you see on the left shows the face of the palace, the gardens, and an odd star-shaped construction near the center top, and that helps us date the view. The star-shaped construction is the Belvedere Fortress, the second and largest fortress to be built in Florence, Italy. It was designed and built by Bernardo Buontalenti, we'll hear more about him in a little bit, over a 5-year period between 1590 and 1595 by order of Grand Duke Ferdinando de' Medici, who was Cosimo and Eleanor's grandson. So this shows us the views from around that time. Gardens are more than just a parcel of land. They include views, decorations of all kinds, statues, grottos, ponds, fountains, and require a water source. Today we're going to take an overview of the garden as well as some of those details. From the outside of the palace, with its sun-baked piazza and no place for visitors to sit, you won't have any idea of either what might be inside or out in the backyard. Still, once you get past the rather forbidding rusticated stone facade, inside is one of the most famous museums in Italy, chock full of paintings, sculpture, religious icons, and a great deal more. Among the treasures inside is art by a female Renaissance artist named Artemisia Gentileschi. You can learn a great deal more about her and her artwork in my Maker of History video. The link is in the description box below. The palace also provides one of the entryways to a delightful garden. The gardens are a huge attraction here in Florence, and especially here in the Oltrarno, which is the area south of the Arno River and somewhat less developed than the area to the north. Gardens actually host twice as many visitors as the palace itself. Whether natural or contrived, grottos were a popular landscape feature in Renaissance landscape architecture, and the Medici gardens were no exception. This is a so-called large grotto designed by Bernardo Buontalenti, who also designed part of the gardens as well as the Belvedere Fort. He was a multi-talented man who spread his skills out over landscape design, architecture, sculpture, and even military works. He worked, among other things, on designs for cannons, designed a fortress, and a type of incendiary grenade. Unfortunately, those gates you see in front of the grotto reflect the reality that I met when I tried to visit. It was closed for repair and has been for some years, so I could only see the rather, to me, unappealing exterior. My very out-of-date Blue Guide for Florence informed me that the decorations on the top of the facade were meant to resemble stalactites. This is apparently the Mannerist style, which I had imagined had disappeared when the Medici did, but I was wrong. Antoni Gaudi of Barcelona resurrected that more or less organic-looking design in his immense Park Jewel and La Sagrada Familia. This grotto sits above ground, obviously so from the exterior, and is embedded between two other buildings. It has 3 rooms or sections and was designed to resemble, at least from the outside, a kind of ground-level cave or shelter, perhaps a natural area in the days before so much of the hill was excavated, which would have given shepherds a place to protect themselves and their flocks from wild animals. On the top right is a partial view of the third and smallest interior room, frescoed and with part of a skylight, and featuring a bathing Venus. If you look closely, you can see that some of the plaster and the delicate flowery decorations has detached from the walls. The statue originally sat in the middle of a working fountain, and I suspect the humidity is responsible for the damage to the plaster. On the bottom right is a room with a completely different character, looking more or less like a forest, perhaps, with another non-working fountain, and this time featuring a copy of one of Michelangelo's 4 prisoners. This one is called The Bearded Slave. The original is kept in the Galleria dell'Accademia here in Florence. I have to admit, I can be incredibly literal-minded, so I always assumed a grotto had to be something in the woods or carved into a hill. But that isn't necessarily the case, at least if you have a good landscaper. What you see here is a courtyard connecting the main part of the palace and its 2 wings, which is also called the Moses Grotto. It got its name from a statue of Moses that resides inside. This photo was taken from a second-level walkway overlooking the Moses courtyard, which you can just make out at the bottom of the image. We'll walk through the gardens along that pathway as far as you can see, past the artichoke fountain near the middle of this photo, and into the amphitheater, now decorated with an Egyptian obelisk and a basin, recovered perhaps from the baths of Caracalla. We'll then walk up that hill. There are steps involved all the way to the Neptune fountain. You'll recall that the palace is built at the base of a fairly steep hill, a significant part of which was quarried to supply the stone we saw in that rather forbidding front facade. The amphitheater was designed afterwards to camouflage the hole in the ground by a man named Tribolo, the original architect Eleanor hired to design the entire garden. The seating and other features that you see now were added much later. Duke Cosimo II, he would have been Cosimo I and Eleanor's great-grandson, decided to convert the area into a walled amphitheater, which when completed looked a good deal like what you see today. In addition to the seating rows, there are numerous niches and various pieces of art and statuary. The building you see in the far distance is the Belvedere Fort, the second and largest fortress to be built in Florence, Italy. It was designed and built by the talented Bernardo Buontalenti. I think his last name means great talent, the same man who designed the grotto we visited earlier. I've learned from my travels not to be quite so literal-minded. Not everything means what it seems. For example, the name Boboli suggested some kind of nymph or cherub, imp or a clown, to this non-Italian-speaking 20-year-old back in 1970, the first time I visited here. It turns out that the name may have been a corruption of the name of one of the earlier owners of this parcel of land. I rather like my imaginary explanation better. The gardens actually begin almost inside the palace with that Moses grotto we already looked at. The artichoke fountain, which you see here, was begun in 1639 and installed between 1641 and 42. I looked in vain when I was there for an artichoke, but I couldn't find one. I've read that some of the decorations on the shells at the sides of the staircase of the fountain resemble artichoke leaves. For centuries after the defeat of Mark Antony and Cleopatra by Octavian, who later became Emperor Augustus, Romans helped themselves to the spoils of war, including quite a few obelisks which were dismounted from their bases and shipped back to Rome. This is one of them. Domitian actually had this obelisk moved to Rome sometime in the 1st century AD and had it planted in the Campus Martius, which was a kind of racetrack. I think it might have been a mile marker. After the fall of Rome, it apparently fell over, was covered with debris, and forgotten until sometime in the 18th century. An inscription at the top mentions Pharaoh Ramesses II. Not content with stealing an enormous 9,000-pound chunk of red granite, which they managed to move intact to Rome in one piece, the Romans decided to fancy it up with a gold globe on top and also added 4 useless turtles at the base. They also brought along a huge basin, which is said to have come from the baths of Caracalla. I reminded you that there was a fairly steep hill involved in this walk. This view, from beyond the Neptune fountain and looking back toward the palace, gives you some idea of the degree of the climb. Water features are always interesting in any garden, even if it's just a bird bath refilled from time to time with a bucket. This garden is filled not just with water features like fountains, but basins like this one, as well as ponds. I don't believe there was any natural water feature in this area initially. Water had to be piped in from the relatively nearby Arno River. The statue you see here is sometimes referred to as the fork. It's cast bronze and represents Neptune with his fork. You could continue climbing up that hill and would end up eventually at the Belvedere, but I turned around at the Neptune fountain and headed back in the general direction of the palace. There are literally dozens of things to see here in the gardens, and sometimes you literally trip over them. Some of them are more interesting than others. This distinctly un-Renaissance-looking head on the left is called the cracked Tindaro. The name made no sense to me until I looked it up. It turns out he was a mythical character in Homer's Iliad. I didn't recognize the name, but I did recognize the general style, a broken head, similar to those I had seen in Sicily and in Pisa. It was carved by the same man, Igor Mitoraj. On the right is a distinctly less exciting, except to me, and then probably only because my family raised horses, statue of Pegasus. More interesting is the sculptor, a guy named Costoli, who spent his entire career in Florence. He's probably better known for attempting, in 1843, to clean and conserve the famous Renaissance-era sculpture of David by Michelangelo. Unfortunately, the fool used hydrochloric acid to clean it and remove the stone's waxy protective coating, leaving it pitted and porous. I think a dedicated gardener could spend quite a bit longer here than I did. Although attendance suffered some during the pandemic, the gardens were one of the safest places for both visitors and Florentines to spend their time, and attendance has recovered. Apparently a good idea to either go very early in the morning or late in the afternoon. I read that the gardens themselves get twice as many visitors as the Pitti Palace, and I have to say I'm not surprised. The bigger museum attraction here in the city would be the Uffizi. The Boboli Gardens have plenty of trails to meander, which will lead you almost all the way to the Porta Romana. Among the many things you'll find on the walk is our last stop, an artificial island in the middle of an artificial lake, Isolotto, which means little lake. The center of the island boasts a replica of a statue of Oceanus, once a fountain, but now, as far as I can tell, no longer working. The original dates from 1576 and sat at first somewhere in the amphitheater, which we walked through at the beginning of our visit. Oceanus is by no means the only mythical inhabitant in this area. At the right, and rising a little weirdly, in my opinion, from out of the middle of the pond is a statue of Perseus, which I didn't even recognize because at this angle, at least, he doesn't seem to be carrying the head of Medusa. We've had a substantial walk, complete with ramps, steps, changes in elevations, and more. So I think it's probably time for us to call it a day. Come back next time for another adventure with me here on The Armchair Traveler.